Okay, we're going to be talking about Joe Worthy's article, Only the Names Have Been Changed, Ability Grouping Revisited. Um, ability grouping and tracking are done to sort students into categories for the purpose of providing differential instruction. When we talk about ability grouping, that's associated with sorting students within a classroom and then providing that differential instruction within the same classroom. When we talk about tracking, tracking is the sorting of students into different classes for the purpose of differential instruction. So when we talk about tracking students, that's where you can see the distinction between, say, a regular history course and a AP history course, or if you're in middle school, it's a regular history course and a pre-AP course. A regular math class versus an advanced math class. And so tracking is when you're sorting students by classroom, not within a classroom. And I think it's important for you to remember that, that we had this period of educational expansion in the 1920s when we had an influx of children of immigrants and immigrant children. And when we were requiring students to go to school for, at certain age levels, and we were expanding the class day, the class day and the number of days that students had to spend in class. And so when we had this increase in the number of people going to school, coupled with people being in school longer, you started seeing this push for organizing children, not just by age categories, but also organizing them by ability groups. And so there was a claim that different types of students were going to school and they needed to have education that was targeted to their needs. So you had like regular courses, and then you had these kind of special programs. One was a vocational program, and another one was a college prep program. Now, in the vocational program, what we tended to see was poor students, and especially students of color, being tracked into vocational education. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had these special programs, college prep programs, which tended to actually be affluent and white students who received this special type of curriculum. Now, this was pretty widespread, and people were researching the impacts or the consequences of being assigned to particular tracks. And by the 1970s, there was ample research showing that there were very real and statistically significant consequences that were associated with students being placed in particular tracks, ability groupings. And one of the concerns was that once a student was assigned to a particular track, it was very rare for the student to be able to be moved from that track, regardless of how they were performing. There was also evidence showing that parents, especially parents with, social and cultural capital, they were able to effectively advocate for their children to be placed in advanced tracks, regardless of what their performance was in terms of on standardized measures like GPAs or performances on tests. And so there was more scrutiny of ability tracking. Also because the evidence was showing that once students were placed into these different tracks, as time progressed, we saw greater and greater differences in students' achievement based on their track placement. So the longer that students were placed in a particular track, the greater the difference was in their abilities and their performances on standardized tests and those kinds of things. in addition to growing gaps in their attitudes towards, say, like learning, or even in their self-esteem. And in the 70s and 80s, because of that literature and the increased visibility of that and its association with like class and race biases, there was a counter movement to discontinue doing those kinds of things, the ability tracking in schools. But in the 1990s, we saw that there was still a significant number of teachers and schools that were using ability grouping or ability tracking, excuse me. And one of the things that we've seen in the literature is that since the 1990s and looking at the late 2000s, ability grouping has actually resurged, where teachers are, a growing number of teachers are supporting the use of ability grouping inside their classrooms. So, for example, one study had surveyed teachers that were teaching in grades K through 3, and they found that ability grouping had actually increased from about 28% of teachers reporting that they were using ability grouping in their reading instruction to 71% of the teachers in 2009 reporting that they were relying on ability grouping when they were doing reading instruction. So it's actually kind of interesting that we're seeing this kind of growth in inequality, economic inequality, and that growth in economic inequality is also tracking with a growth in preferences for doing ability tracking. Remember, and just think about the consequences in terms of what's happening outside of classrooms, in the communities, and how that impacts what happens within classrooms. And so I don't think that should be lost on you as you're reading this work. Okay, so in Worthy's original study, the intention was to examine reading instruction of 6th grade English or language arts teachers. They were intending to interview teachers at 8 middle schools of a large urban school district. These are the demographics of the school district, where it was 56% of the students were below poverty, 53% were Latino, 14% were African American, and 33% were white. There were 8 middle schools. 4 middle schools were predominantly low-income minority middle schools. 2 schools were upper middle class suburban middle schools. And then there were 2 schools that were considered to be racially and ethnically mixed, and then also socioeconomically mixed. The 5th grade teachers were responsible for making the placement of students who were moving into 6th grade, to assign them into either honors or regular tracked classes. Parents, though, could request whether or not their students got tracked into regular or honors courses, and parent requests were almost always honored. The schools that were serving middle income or higher income areas tended to have more honors classes than regular classes. And in the study, they were interviewing 25 6th grade teachers whose teaching experience ranged from 1 to 23 years, with the teachers having an average of 4.5 years of teaching experience. There were 2 levels of language arts instruction. There were honors classes and regular courses. They conducted 25 interviews and made and observed classes, or had 18 observations over the course of their study. Now, the interesting thing is that even though that was the original intention of this research project, the researcher decided to actually write a paper focusing on ability grouping because of the way that the instructors were actually talking about their courses. And so, originally, right, the focus was to look at instructional materials in language art classes through teacher interviews. But when questions were posed to the teachers would often make the distinction about, well, who are you talking about? Do you want me to talk about my regular classes, or do you want me to talk about my honors classes? And so, Worthy talks about how there wasn't even that distinction made within the original research design of her project. But because this came up so frequently, she wound up doing an analysis of their work, of the teachers' characterizations of students as a separate research project. And so, again, the teachers made these kind of distinctions that the students were different in terms of their work habits, their behaviors, their ability, their interest in learning. And often the teachers attributed those differences that they saw in their students as differences that where they were based on differences in their home life. The teachers rarely mentioned individual students and often spoke in broad generalizations, and often without actually having evidence for some of the claims that they were actually making. So the teachers talked about a difference in the instruction in the classroom environment, again, honors classes and regular classes being different. They talked about their honors classes being places where they could, have creative instruction, where they could use sophisticated materials, where they allowed their students to work with others, and where students were responsible for their own behaviors. In contrast, the regular classes were, and the instruction was often, the skills were often isolated, and the teachers focused on basic skills. They used simple materials. They rigidly controlled their classrooms. They read below grade level. The expectation was that the students would fill out worksheets, and those things were oriented towards preparing for standardized tests. The teachers actually talked about the regular students as doing remedial work or lots of seat work without a lot of talking or without a lot of discussion. They also made mention that they didn't allow the students to select their own reading material. And they gave them less time in class to actually read on their own. One instructor said that they would only give them about 20 minutes time to read on their own, because that was about all that they could handle. In the courses, in the regular courses, they also talked about how, or Worthy actually says that the way that the teachers talked about their regular courses, they tended to place more emphasis on behavior and on working quietly. So these kind of like controlling the student than on actual learning. The teachers also had differences in expectations. Again, because they assumed that students, enjoyed reading, had strong interest, liked to be challenged. They didn't really need to monitor those students. They also gave students chances and opportunities to do creative, challenging projects. And again, that's rooted in the expectation that students would rise to the occasion to be able to do those types of things. Whereas with the regular classes, the teachers tended to have and speak about them in terms of having like really low expectations, that, the kids lacked foundational skills, that they were unable to handle work or responsibility. They didn't even bother giving, or they didn't assign homework to their students because they just assumed and they were sure that the students wouldn't actually do that work. So, why bother? Again, they gave them less time to read because they assumed that they couldn't handle reading for extended periods of time. And what was interesting here too is that the teachers, because they had this expectation that the students in honors classes would do their work and would be engaged, they gave them these interesting projects to do. And even in their regular classes, when the regular students saw what the honor students were doing and asked if they could do similar work, the regular students were denied that opportunity. So again, these students were not given the freedom to choose what they would like to read. Then they were penalized for not being engaged in their reading. And then they were being controlled and micromanaged with their tasks because they weren't reading. And so it was this really kind of negative self-fulfilling prophecy that was happening with the courses. And there were teachers who were trying to give their regular students, equally challenging and engaging material. And those teachers were experiencing pressure from their colleagues for making those types of choices. So again, this kind of the power of the group to try and reinforce this, having lower expectations for regular students, and less engaging material for their regular students, and reserving that kind of enriching experience and opportunities for the honors students. So what's another, I always say what's interesting, but what we also saw was that the teachers were talking about the differences between the two types of students, and really emphasizing the regular students and speaking about them with this very strong deficiency tone. Like those students were lacking things, and the teachers who were making serious assumptions about the students and their home environment, and their experiences as having an impact on the students, often in the absence of any evidence. So for example, when talking about the regular students, teachers would talk about how the how the parents of the regular students were unsupportive, poor academic role models, economically disadvantaged, didn't have access to books. The teachers, one teacher said that the kids weren't getting the right kinds of out of school experiences, or the students had never even seen a library. The other thing that we saw among the teachers talking about their regular students was related to ability levels. Again, kind of talking about these kind of innate differences between regular students versus honor students, where regular students were framed as being unwilling or incapable of doing challenging work. Now, they would also say that this was a consequence of social promotion that happened at other and earlier grade levels. And so the teachers now were kind of dealing with these deficient students, and they would talk about how the previous schools basically had failed to challenge the students in the regular classes, and so they were left to have to grapple with these kids who are reading below grade level, who are uninterested in reading, right? And that, instead of being a rationale to provide a different type of educational experience, was actually used as a justification to continue to do and to teach in a way that perpetuated the low expectations, the simple tasks, the busy work, the seat work, right? The work that emphasized conformity for the regular students. And so, these teachers were, for the most part, complicit in creating and reproducing these differences in educational experiences. And you remember that it was the fifth grade teachers who were making the decisions about whether the students should be assigned to honors or regular courses. And structurally, the schools that had the upper middle class student population had many more honors courses available for them, and the other schools didn't have as many. And so, this is something that, one, structurally, right, there are differences and opportunities in terms of the assignment to the types of classes. But the other thing is how the way that the teachers in the middle schools conceptualized honors, students who took honors classes versus students who took regular classes, they were coming into the school tracked, right? And the regular classes were classes that were defined by low expectations and marginal instruction. And in the past, right, we actually used to have 3 ability groupings. You would have ability groupings by, below grade level, on grade level, and advanced. And when you look at the groupings that are happening at the middle schools, you've got regular groups, and then you've got honors groups. And people and parents, especially without the cultural capital, like we were talking about with Annette LaRue's work, but without being aware of the structural differences in terms of ability grouping versus ability tracking, but also not being aware of how schools think about honor students versus regular students. If you didn't have that cultural capital and that understanding, parents may not actually be aware that their children would be receiving a qualitatively different experience when it comes to instruction and expectation based on regular versus honors class, right? So again, we think about symbolic interactionism and that idea that you've got these 2 labels, honors and regular. And among the teachers, they'll have a particular conceptualization of honors and regular. And then for parents of different educational backgrounds, and awareness, they could have different interpretations of what an honors class is versus a regular class is. And without having a shared understanding of the meaning, they could be making choices for their children that create disadvantages for them without understanding that it's not just a disadvantage for that year, right? It's a year of low expectations for the regular students, right? And then those low expectations are going to have real consequences in terms of how much students learn and develop new skill sets that then set the stage for their assignments for the next year, right? So the tracking creates a differential learning experience, differential instruction, differential expectations, but then those things produce these long-term consequences. And this is where we're thinking about, and I want you to think about, the reproduction of inequality and how parents with cultural capital will know, one, to fight for their kids to be placed in the honors class, right? And they'll leverage their social and cultural capital to do that. At the same time that the teachers who are receiving these kids in middle school, one, all they have to go on are the recommendations that are happening from the elementary school. And so the kids whose parents don't have social and cultural capital will not be doing that same kind of advocacy. And because of that, their kids are going to be placed into these different learning environments that have very real consequences. And so the existence of honors courses and regular courses is an example of a constitutive rule, right? It's an institutional practice that shapes and governs behavior. And so ability grouping is a constitutive rule. And that ability grouping, right, then shapes the students' behaviors and engagement with their schooling experience, right? So I want you to think about Jackson's work. Think about LaRue's work, think about Parsons' work. Like, all of those pieces can help you understand how the organization of schooling can have not just an immediate impact on how students feel about their schooling experience, but it can have long-term, lifelong consequences in terms of ultimately where students wind up in terms of the inequality that exists in our broader society. Okay, I'm going to stop right there.